In a sterile laboratory in occupied Manchuria, a Japanese doctor carefully adjusts his mask before approaching the struggling figure strapped to a metal table. The prisoner, a Chinese civilian, watches in terror as the doctor selects a scalpel. No anesthesia is administered. What follows is a vivisection, a dissection performed on a fully conscious human being. The prisoner's screams echo through the facility known as Unit 731, where over 3,000 victims would meet similar fates in the name of medical research. Elsewhere, young women as young as 12 are lined up and inspected like cattle before being forced into wooden structures that would become their prisons. These comfort stations housed what the Japanese military euphemistically called comfort women. In reality, sex slaves forced to service up to 40 soldiers daily. Many would die from disease, beatings, or suicide. Those who survived would carry the physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Meanwhile, in Nazi-controlled territories, prisoners of war are marched through freezing conditions without adequate clothing. Those who collapse are shot on sight. Survivors are packed into boxcars so tightly that many suffocate or are crushed to death before reaching concentration camps, where systematic starvation and brutal labor await. This isn't fiction. This isn't exaggeration. These are documented atrocities from World War II that rarely make it into history textbooks, systematic abuses that claimed millions of lives and destroyed countless others. If you've ever wondered what dark chapters of history have been sanitized or omitted entirely from what you learned in school, subscribe to Dark History Class right now. We uncover the uncomfortable truths others won't tell you, truths that need to be remembered. World War II has been thoroughly documented in countless books, documentaries, and films, yet many of us remain unaware of the systematic atrocities committed against prisoners, civilians, and entire populations. The war claimed between 70 and 85 million lives, about 3% of the world's population at the time, but numbers alone cannot convey the deliberate cruelty and methodical abuse that characterized this global conflict. The question at the heart of today's Dark History Class is not simply what happened, but how human beings could systematically organize and institutionalize such profound cruelty against other human beings. How did governments and military organizations create structures that enabled and encouraged torture, sexual slavery, and medical experimentation on living subjects? These stories matter today not as historical curiosities, but as stark warnings. They demonstrate how quickly the veneer of civilization can crack, revealing humanity's capacity for calculated brutality. They show how ordinary people, doctors, soldiers, administrators, can become perpetrators of unimaginable cruelty when operating within systems designed to dehumanize others. Today, we'll explore three of the most disturbing systems of abuse during World War II, Japan's Unit 731 and its nightmarish human experimentation program, the Comfort Women sexual slavery system that enslaved thousands, and the systematic abuse of prisoners of war that violated every principle of human dignity. What makes these stories particularly chilling is not just their horror, but their organization. These weren't chaotic acts of individual cruelty in the fog of war. They were deliberate, bureaucratically managed systems with organizational charts, supply chains, and official documentation. They represent what happens when the machinery of government and military power is turned toward the systematic dehumanization of those deemed other. Our journey into this dark chapter begins in rural Manchuria, at a complex innocuously named the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kuomintang Army. Behind this benign title operated Unit 731, Japan's biological and chemical warfare research facility, where human experimentation reached unprecedented levels of cruelty. Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii, a physician and microbiologist, established this facility with the full knowledge and support of the Japanese government. A brilliant but ruthless scientist, Ishii convinced military leaders that biological warfare could be Japan's secret weapon. What followed was a program so horrific that many of its records were destroyed, and survivors remained silent for decades out of fear and trauma. The facility's victims, whom Japanese researchers called maruta, or logs, were primarily Chinese civilians and prisoners of war, though Koreans, Russians, and Allied POWs also suffered there. Between 1937 and 1945, an estimated 3,000 people died at Unit 731 and its sister facilities. The true number may be much higher. What makes Unit 731 particularly disturbing was its clinical approach to atrocity. Highly educated doctors and scientists conducted experiments with the cold precision of legitimate research. They meticulously recorded data as they vivisected conscious subjects without anesthesia to observe living organs. deliberately infected prisoners with plague, anthrax, and other pathogens, subjected victims to extreme temperatures until their limbs froze solid, then attempted to thaw them for frostbite research, placed subjects in pressure chambers until their eyes bulged out, deliberately deprived prisoners of food and water to study dehydration and starvation. One survivor who worked as a janitor at the facility later testified, "I saw human experiments carried out on Chinese people. They would bring out a prisoner, tie them to a post, and then use them for bayonet practice or chemical weapons experiments. The prisoners would scream in agony as they died a slow and painful death." The documents revealing these atrocities were nearly lost to history. Subscribe to Dark History class to ensure these crucial lessons from humanity's darkest moments are never forgotten. The most disturbing aspect of Unit 731 wasn't just the experiments themselves, but what happened afterward. When the war ended, the United States discovered the unit's activities and made a morally catastrophic decision. Instead of prosecuting these war criminals, American authorities granted immunity to Ishii and his colleagues in exchange for their data. While Nazi doctors faced justice at Nuremberg, the perpetrators of Unit 731 returned to successful careers in medicine, academia, and business in post-war Japan. This deliberate cover-up meant that many victims never saw justice, and the full extent of Unit 731's activities remained obscured for decades. Ishii lived comfortably until his death from throat cancer in 1959, never facing consequences for orchestrating some of the most inhumane experiments in modern history. While Unit 731 operated under the guise of medical research, another system of abuse was implemented with far less pretense. Beginning in 1932 and expanding throughout the war, the Japanese Imperial Army established what they called comfort stations, a euphemism for military-controlled brothels where women were systematically raped and abused. What many don't realize is the industrial scale of this sexual slavery system. By 1945, up to 200,000 women had been enslaved in these facilities spread across Japanese-occupied territories. These women, euphemistically called comfort women, were primarily Korean, Chinese, and Filipino, though women from every occupied territory were victimized. The most chilling aspect of this system was its bureaucratic organization. Government documents reveal that the Comfort Women program was established with clear objectives: to prevent Japanese soldiers from committing random sexual violence that might turn local populations against them, to prevent the spread of venereal diseases among troops, and to provide comfort to maintain military morale. A former Japanese army doctor later testified, "The women were simply treated as military supplies. Once a month I would examine them for venereal diseases like cattle. Those who were infected were injected with arsenic compounds. Many died from these treatments." While many assume these women were professional prostitutes, historical records tell a far different story. Military documents and survivor testimonies reveal systematic kidnapping, coercion, and deception. Young women and girls, some as young as 12, were often told they would be working in factories or hospitals, only to find themselves imprisoned in comfort stations where escape was impossible. Kim Hak-sun, the first Korean comfort woman to speak publicly about her experience, recounted, "I was beaten and threatened when I refused to serve the soldiers. Each day I was forced to serve between 10 and 40 men. We were not treated as humans but as military supplies without any rights." For decades after the war, these women's stories remained buried under layers of shame, diplomatic evasion, and deliberate cover-ups. It wasn't until the 1990s that survivors began to speak out, demanding recognition and justice. Many died waiting for an official apology. History's darkest chapters are often the most deliberately hidden. Join Dark History class to uncover the suppressed stories that powerful institutions don't want examined. The third system of abuse during World War II extended to prisoners of war, where both the Axis and Allied powers committed violations, though with crucial differences in scale, intent, and systematization. Under Nazi control, captured Soviet soldiers faced particularly brutal treatment. Of the 5.7 million Soviet POWs captured by German forces, an estimated 3.3 million, or 57%, died in captivity. This wasn't accidental, it was policy. Hitler's Commissar Order explicitly called for the execution of Soviet political officers, while the Barbarossa Decree suspended military jurisdiction on the Eastern Front, effectively allowing German troops to commit atrocities without consequence. Former Wehrmacht soldier Franz Seidler later admitted, "We were told that Slavs were subhuman. The Soviet prisoners received perhaps a quarter of the rations given to other POWs. They died by the thousands from starvation, disease, and exposure. We watched them eat grass and bark from trees. In the Pacific Theater, Japanese treatment of Allied prisoners revealed equally disturbing patterns. The infamous death railway between Thailand and Burma claimed the lives of over 12,000 Allied POWs and 90,000 Asian laborers who were forced to construct it under impossible conditions. Prisoners were routinely beaten, starved, and denied medical care while being forced to meet impossible work quotas. Australian POW survivor Edward Weary Dunlop documented in his secret diary, "Men are dying at the rate of 20 to 30 daily." The Japanese medical officer, when asked for quinine for the many malaria cases, replies, "No medicine for British prisoners, all die." What few history classes teach is that this systematic abuse was directly connected to the Japanese concept of Bushido, or way of the warrior, a distorted wartime interpretation that considered surrender the ultimate dishonor. Japanese military indoctrination taught that capture was shameful beyond redemption, making those who surrendered unworthy of humane treatment. This ideological framework transformed cruelty from an individual failing into a virtue, allowing ordinary soldiers to commit extraordinary acts of brutality while believing they were upholding their moral code. The result was a 27% death rate for Western Allied POWs in Japanese camps, 7 times the death rate of Allied prisoners held by Nazi Germany on the Western Front. For Asian prisoners, the death rate was much higher, with some estimates exceeding 50%. One of the most disturbing aspects of POW abuse was the development of medical experimentation conducted on prisoners. At Ravensbrück concentration camp, Nazi doctors deliberately wounded Polish women, nicknamed the Rabbits, to test sulfonamide drugs and bone transplantation techniques. Many victims were left permanently disabled, while others died from the procedures or subsequent infections. Jadwiga Zido, who survived these experiments, testified at Nuremberg, "They cut into my leg without anesthesia. I could feel everything, the knife cutting through my flesh, the sore on my bone. They were watching my reactions as if I wasn't human. The voices of history's victims deserve to be heard. Subscribe to Dark History Class, where we ensure their testimonies aren't silenced by time or deliberate forgetting." These systems of abuse, Unit 731, the Comfort Women Program, and POW mistreatment reveal a disturbing pattern. In each case, bureaucratic structures and ideological frameworks transformed what would normally be considered atrocities into sanctioned policy. Documents, testimonies, and historical records show how military and government officials methodically planned, implemented, and concealed these abuses. Perhaps most chilling was the participation of professionals, doctors, scientists, administrators, and lawyers who used their expertise not to uphold ethical standards, but to optimize systems of cruelty. The same organizational skills that might have been used to build hospitals or schools were instead directed toward efficient systems of torture, exploitation, and death. Dr. Robert J. Lifton, who extensively interviewed Nazi doctors, observed, "The medicalization of killing, the use of medical concepts to justify murder, was central to the whole Nazi killing enterprise. These weren't monsters, they were ordinary men who had convinced themselves they were serving a higher purpose." This systematic dehumanization extended beyond military personnel to civilian populations across occupied territories. One of the least discussed aspects of World War II was the deliberate starvation of civilian populations as a military strategy. In the Netherlands, the hunger winter of 1944-1945 resulted from a German blockade that cut off food and fuel shipments to punish the Dutch for resistance activities. Over 22,000 civilians died of starvation. Children born to mothers who survived this famine later showed higher rates of obesity, diabetes, and mental illness, demonstrating how the trauma of systematic abuse continues for generations. Dirk Boer, who was 10 years old during the hunger winter, recalled, "We ate tulip bulbs and sugar beets. My mother would make a kind of bread from ground tulip bulbs. It tasted terrible and made us sick, but we had no choice. I watched my neighbors' children die one by one. Their bodies were so swollen from hunger that they didn't even look human anymore." While the Holocaust rightfully received significant historical attention, far fewer people know about the hunger plan, the Nazi policy to deliberately starve tens of millions of Slavs to death to create living space for German settlers. This wasn't a wartime improvisation, but a carefully calculated strategy. Herbert Backe, State Secretary in the Reich Ministry of Food, developed detailed plans for diverting Ukrainian grain to Germany while ensuring local populations would starve. The Nazi leadership explicitly discussed how many millions would die. As Hermann Goering told a conference of Reich commissioners in 1941, if anyone goes hungry, it will not be the Germans. In the old days, the rule was to kill 100 Slavs if one German was killed. I would say that if one German starves, numerous inhabitants of the East will have to die. While the full hunger plan was never completely implemented due to military setbacks, millions of Soviet civilians and POWs still starved to death under German occupation. In besieged Leningrad alone, over 800,000 civilians died, many from starvation during the 872-day blockade. These weren't incidental deaths from wartime shortages. Documents reveal they were the intended outcome of policies designed at the highest levels of government. The systematic nature of wartime abuse extended to forced labor programs that supplied both the German and Japanese war machines. By 1944, foreign workers constituted about 20% of the German workforce. Many were subjected to brutal conditions, starvation rations, and punishment for the slightest infractions. Nikolai Maslov, a Russian teenager forced to work in a German factory, later wrote, "We slept on bare wooden bunks in unheated barracks. For food we received watery soup and a piece of bread so small you could hide it in your palm. Anyone who couldn't keep up with production quotas was beaten. Many simply worked until they collapsed and died." The systemic nature of historical atrocities is often buried beneath simplistic narratives. Subscribe to Dark History class, where we examine the organizational structures that enabled humanity's darkest moments. In the aftermath of these atrocities, justice was inconsistent and often politically motivated. While the Nuremberg and Tokyo trials held some perpetrators accountable, many others escaped punishment. After the war, Cold War priorities meant that many war criminals received immunity in exchange for their knowledge or expertise. Perhaps the most disturbing example was Operation Paperclip, through which the United States recruited Nazi scientists regardless of their wartime activities. Wernher von Braun, who later became celebrated for his work on the American space program, had overseen a V-2 rocket factory that used slave labor from concentration camps. An estimated 20,000 prisoners died producing these weapons, more than were killed by the rockets themselves when launched against Allied cities. What few realize is that both the United States and Soviet Union deliberately protected war criminals who possessed valuable scientific knowledge. Documents declassified decades later revealed that Japanese Unit 731 researchers received immunity from American authorities in exchange for their human experimentation data. Dr. Shiro Ishii, who had overseen vivisections and biological warfare tests on thousands of victims, lived comfortably in Japan until his death in 1959. Lieutenant General Charles Willoughby, who managed this cover-up as General MacArthur's intelligence chief, justified it in a recently declassified memo. The value to the US of Japanese biological warfare data is of such importance to national security as to far outweigh the value accruing from war crimes prosecution. This pragmatic approach to justice meant that many victims never saw their tormentors held accountable. It also created dangerous precedents about what would be tolerated in future conflicts. The systematic abuse of prisoners, civilians, and entire populations during World War II represents one of humanity's darkest chapters. What makes these atrocities particularly disturbing isn't just their scale, but their organization. The fact that governments and military hierarchies created bureaucratic systems specifically designed to inflict suffering and death. These weren't chaotic acts of individual cruelty. They were methodical programs implemented through chains of command, documented in official records, and justified through elaborate ideological frameworks. They demonstrate how institutions, even those built around principles like medicine, law, and military honor, can become perverted into machinery for organized brutality. Perhaps most chilling is how ordinary people became willing participants in these systems. The doctors who performed vivisections at Unit 731, the administrators who managed comfort women stations, and the officers who enforced starvation policies weren't born monsters. They were educated professionals who gradually accepted the unacceptable, normalized the unthinkable, and ultimately participated in systematic cruelty on an industrial scale. The lessons from this dark history remain urgently relevant today. They warn us about the fragility of ethical boundaries, the danger of dehumanizing rhetoric, and how easily institutional power can be turned towards systematic abuse. They remind us that the greatest atrocities aren't always committed by obvious villains, but by ordinary people who convince themselves they're following orders, serving a greater good, or simply doing their jobs. In remembering these victims and understanding the systems that enabled their suffering, we honor their memory and strengthen our collective resolve to recognize and resist the early warning signs of institutional cruelty. The darkest chapters of history contain the most important lessons for our future. Here at Dark History Class, we believe that confronting these uncomfortable truths is essential for creating a more just world. If you found value in this exploration of systematic wartime abuse, subscribe now and join our community of historical truth seekers. Together, we'll continue unearthing the hidden stories that powerful institutions would prefer remained buried, because only by understanding our darkest moments can we truly work toward a brighter future. Hit subscribe, enable notifications, and join us next week when we uncover another suppressed chapter in humanity's troubled past.